Development and maintenance of bone. To begin, we're going to look at how a bone develops. We're going to call this process endochondral ossification. If we break that word down, we're going to get endo, which means inside of, chondral means cartilage, and then ossify or osseous refers to as bone. So in this case, we're going to have the formation of bone inside of cartilage. To begin this process, we've got to have a cartilage model forming. So we're going to get a little bone, so to speak, made out of cartilage, and it's going to look kind of like it will in the adult form, and it's going to be in the same area. That cartilage model then is going to continue to grow. It does have to take on a little bit more of an adult orientation. The cells inside called chondroblast, chondro again refers to cartilage, blast means to create. So these cells that had created the cartilage model are going to die. We're going to then create something called a primary ossification center. This is where the beginning of the bone starts to form. Arteries are going to grow into the diaphysis. Remember that the diaphysis is the shaft of the bone. Bone cells, osteocytes, need a good blood supply in order to survive. Cartilage, on the other hand, does not need a good blood supply. So if we're going to replace the cartilage with bone, we've got to make sure that some blood vessels grow into this particular area. With the introduction of a blood supply, we're going to have some cells called osteoblasts. Again, osteo refers to bone, blast refers to creation. These are going to be cells that are creating bone. They're going to enter into the diaphysis of the bone and form trabeculae. Remember that trabeculae is spongy bone. Osteoclasts now, which are cells that are going to break down bone, so osteo again refers to bone, clast in this case means to break down or destroy. They're going to form what we call the medullary cavity, or the hollow space in the center of the diaphysis. Taking a look at the picture here, we start on the left with the development of the cartilage model. Then in the center, that model continues to grow. Once the artery and veins grow into the center of the bone, then we get that primary ossification center forming. We've got chondrocytes or chondroblasts dying. We've got osteoblasts moving into the area and starting to lay down trabeculae. And then, of course, we're going to have some osteoclasts coming in and making the medullary cavity. The next thing that we have to do is what's called secondary ossification, because primary ossification only creates bone in the diaphysis. Secondary ossification is going to create bone at the epiphysis. So it does occur at the epiphysis. And once we've got bone formed on the epiphysis, we then have to finish up this process by including articular cartilages and the epiphyseal plate. The articulating cartilages, we know, are going to cushion the ends of the joints and decrease friction when the bones are moving. The epiphyseal plate, however, is a piece of cartilage that remains between the diaphysis and the epiphysis. The function of the epiphyseal plate is to ensure that the bone can still grow, because, of course, when the fetus comes out of mom and is now a baby, we would continue to grow throughout life. So we need a place to do that, because bone, being a solid tissue, otherwise wouldn't be able to grow. So the function then of articulating cartilages is to cushion the joint, and the epiphyseal plate's function is to allow the bone to continue growing. If you look at this picture, similar events are going to happen in secondary ossification. We're going to have to begin by having an artery and a vein grow into the center of the epiphysis. We're going to then have chondroblasts dying. We're going to have osteocytes invading that tissue and laying down bone. The difference here is that the trabeculae of the secondary ossification stays in place, and that gives us the spongy bone of the adult tissue. We then overlay that with the articulating cartilages, and on the right you can see the epiphyseal plate is a band of hyaline cartilage that's going to remain so that we can continue to grow from this particular area. Bone also has the ability to undergo remodeling. This is going to happen with some cells called osteoclasts, and if you remember from just a minute ago, osteo means bone and clast means to destroy. So these are going to break down the hydroxyapatite, or the inorganic portion of the bone. The hydroxyapatite is actually a calcium phosphate crystal, and so when that gets broken down, the calcium and the phosphate have the ability to enter into the bloodstream. Osteoblasts, then, are cells that make bone. So these guys are going to create bone matrix, or basically the material that surrounds the osteocytes. The deposition and the breakdown of bone are dependent on stress. So let's say that you decide to go to the gym and start working out, lifting weights. You're going to put more stress on your bone, and as a result, your bone will actually get thicker or bigger in the area where the stress is applied. If you should be unfortunate enough, let's say, to break a bone and stop using that bone, you decrease the amount of stress on the bone, you would then have the bone reabsorbed or broken down more so than created. So if you increase the stress, you increase bone deposition. As you decrease the stress, you increase the breakdown of that same bone. This picture just shows you where we would have some increased stress. If you look off to the left, the first bone has more stress on the inside of the bone than it does on the outside. And as a result, this bone is going to remodel itself. It's going to add new bone to the side that has more stress on it, and it's going to remove bone from the side that has less stress. Ultimately, the stress that's being put on the bone will be equalized to either side. We're now going to look at some bone homeostasis, and just a little side note that this is something that would occur as a result of endocrine organs. Let's say our stimulus is a drop in blood calcium levels. A gland called the parathyroid is going to release a hormone called parathyroid hormone. This causes osteoclasts to begin working. We know that osteoclasts are going to break down bone, and we're going to take that hydroxyapatite and put it back into the bloodstream. So we would have the calcium and phosphate from the hydroxyapatite getting back into the blood. So the calcium is released into the bloodstream, and as a result, we would have our blood calcium levels go back up. Let's say, however, that our stimulus for this process is an increase in blood calcium levels. We're going to have another hormone called calcitonin released. That gets released from the parafollicular cells of the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland is located in the neck. Calcitonin, and this is really corny, but this is how I remember it, calcitonin bonin. So calcitonin takes calcium from the blood and puts it in the bone. So we're going to store that inside of the bone. By doing that, we would stimulate osteoblasts, because of course it's the osteoblast that's going to make the bone matrix and get that calcium back into the bone. It also inhibits osteoclast activity so that we have no further breakdown of bone. This picture here just shows you your thyroid and parathyroid glands. The thyroid is the one from the anterior view, so it kind of looks like a butterfly shape. And then on the right-hand side, if you take that same structure, the larynx, and turn it around and look at the posterior side, you can see that there's 4 little dots in yellow. Those 4 little dots are the parathyroid glands. Osteoporosis is something that we're going to just take a real quick look at. This is a condition when the parathyroid hormone outpaces calcitonin. So we're going to have more breakdown than we are deposition of bone. We're going to lose bone mass as a result, and the bones actually become brittle and very, very porous. If you take a look at this picture, the picture on the left is normal trabeculae or normal spongy bone. The picture on the right you can see is the situation with osteoporosis. Where the arrow is, you can see that there's even a little fracture of that particular part of the bone. When you have all these little fractures, it really significantly decreases the strength of the bone. And as a result, many people will end up doing things like breaking hips. Bone repair, now, on the other hand, if you've ever broken a bone, you know that the bone can, in fact, repair itself. So let's start with that. The first thing that's going to happen is that you're going to fracture or break the bone. Since we know that there's blood supplies associated with the bone is, in fact, going to bleed. It's going to create a hematoma, which is a blood clot. The next thing that's going to happen is we're going to create a fibrocartilaginous callus around the outside of the two ends of the broken bone. So we're going to get a really big bump in addition to some really cool coloring from the hematoma. The next thing that's going to happen is osteoclasts are going to invade the area and remove old, worn out, or no longer usable bone. And ultimately, the osteoblasts are going to migrate into the area, and they're going to replace that fibrocartilaginous callus with bone.